A Shavua Tov, my holy sisters and brothers, a good vach, a good week to you. We're coming out of Shabbos. We're excited to be learning together. Let's light up the darkness with a new candle. Come on. Too much wax on the wick. All right, who's with us as we start a new week with some beautiful learning? Tonight, we've got a colorful page. Let me tell you, you guys are going to enjoy this one. Hana Rivka says, Shavua Tov. Renee Fott says, Hineni, here I am. Miriam says, Shavua Tov. James says, Shalom. Chaim is saying good vach from Charlotte. And Mark says, Oklahoma in the house. Bill is with us saying Shabbat Shalom. I can just hear Willie Nelson singing today's title. Well, sorta. Right? Mamas don't let your babies grow up to be Amei Haaretz, ignoramuses. We'll be talking about that. Holly in Fort Myers, Janice in Dallas, Miriam in Hayden, Colorado, Eric KC, Kansas City, Missouri. Zach says Shavua Tov. Larry Rifkin, a Shavua Tov from Boca Raton. And Carlos is saying Shalom, everybody. It's great to be with you. Lynn in Texas. And Bernie Shavua Tov from Omaha. It's great to be with you. Tonight's class, and I want to just keep moving because there's a lot to cover. Tonight's class is dedicated by Joel Marcus for the healing of Glenna M. May Glenna M receive a complete and speedy recovery. May we only hear good news, and we say amen. And Joel, may you and your entire family be showered in blessings. Thank you for supporting our nonprofit, enabling our learning. This class is dedicated, the merit of our learning tonight, dedicated to your family and to the healing of Glenna M. Also dedicated by Rabbi Aryeh Markman, our good friend here in LA, the head of Aish LA. Beautiful organization doing wonderful work, helping Jews to get educated in Torah, and so preventing them from becoming Amei Haaretz, ignoramuses. That's what tonight's lesson is all about. Thank you for all your good work, Rabbi Aryeh and Oz and everybody at Aish here in LA and throughout the world. May you all be strengthened in your important work to 120, and we say amen. And Rabbi Markman, may you and your family be showered in blessings. Thank you for dedicating tonight's class, and we say amen. Okay, lots to cover tonight. Where are we holding? This is Daf Mem Tes. We're gonna be starting right on Mem Tes, page 49. We're in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. Page 49, we're in chapter 3. We're going to open and cover quite quickly. Where am I? Quite quickly, Mishnah number 7, and then we're going to get into our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Within Mishnah number 8, we're going to quickly digress from the matter at hand. It'll be a logical digression, and then we're going to hear the sages' views. And it's not so surprising that the sages, who themselves were a community of scholars, of Torah scholars, they're the sages. After all, of course, they appreciate wisdom, and therefore, would have a negative view towards an ignoramus, towards people who give up the chance to learn, shall we say. But their feelings become very strong against ignoramuses. And we might think, well, a lot of ignoramuses, it's not their fault. I mean, they just didn't have the opportunity to become learned. Are we going to hold that against them? The prevailing view is that's not what the sages were talking about. The sages were talking about is people who had the opportunity to learn and viewed learning, specifically Torah learning, with contempt. And they were a danger to the Jewish people, and that's why the sages had such strong views about them. We'll get to that in our discussion of the 8th Mishnah. Let's quickly jump into the 7th Mishnah. Like I said, our discussion of it is going to be quite fast. It's a very short Mishnah, very short Gemara, short discussion of it, and then we'll get into Mishnah number 8. So, the 7th Mishnah here in chapter 3. And actually, this is what I meant to do before I realized how important number 8 was going to be. But we'll just do this quickly anyway. I want to read you Mishnah number 7 twice. The first time, simply the way it would be translated, just the Mishnah itself. So I'm using the Koren Talmud. And what the Koren does is it puts the words of the Mishnah pure and simple, translating from Hebrew. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew to English, and that's in bold type. And then the non-bold type includes the elucidation of Rav Steinsaltz, right? So if you can see over there, there's bold and there's not bold. And what that's about is the bold is the Mishnah and the not bold is Rav Steinsaltz teaching it for us so that we can really understand what's going on. Now, often he's sort of jumping in with rulings from further on so that the Mishnah, when we're reading it, we can really get the full sense of it. Why? Because when the Torah scholars were studying these Mishnahs, they were fully aware of what was implied by the very terse, nearly coded language of the Mishnah. So just so we get this feeling, so if the Mishnah was just translated, we would say, the 14th that occurs on Shabbos, one removes all before Shabbos. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say, at its time. Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok says, teruma before Shabbos, non-sacred at their time. Right? So that's how short and terse the Mishnah is. Did you get it? Did you follow everything that was taught there? Now let's read it again the way Rav Steinsaltz would elucidate it. So with regard to the 14th of Nissan that occurs on Shabbos, one removes all leaven from his possession, whether it is teruma or non-sacred food, before Shabbos. Right? So the 14th is the day of Passover starts that night. On the 14th, as we've learned from the beginning of this tractate, we have to get all the leaven out of our possession. We did a search on the night before, the night of the 14th. The morning of the 14th, we're all prepared. We eat the last of our chametz. We've sold it. Whatever's not going to remain in our possession, we keep a little bit to burn at 11 a.m., approximately 11 a.m., the beginning of the 6th hour. And it was taught in the, where am I? So that's what we do on the 14th. And when the 14th occurs on Shabbos, what do? Do we remove now we can't burn our chametz on Shabbos. That's the issue, right? So the sages are telling us what to do when the time that we would normally burn chametz, which is the morning before Passover starts that night. But if that morning is Shabbos, how do we handle it? One choice is we burn it the day before on Friday because we can't burn it on Shabbos. Another alternative is we remove it from our possession, not by burning. It's not optimal, but the sages, as we've already seen, allow us to crumble it and scatter it in the wind or throw it in the ocean or even nullify it, right? So here we are. When the 14th of Nissan occurs on Shabbos, one removes all leaven from his possession, whether it's consecrated teruma or non-sacred food, before Shabbos, except for that which will be eaten during the first part of Shabbos. In that case, one cannot remove leaven from his possession on the 14th of Nissan itself, as he does in other years, right? Because he can't burn it. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say one may remove leaven at its usual time on the 14th of Nissan by throwing it away or declaring it ownerless. Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok says teruma should be removed before Shabbos, as only a few people are permitted to eat it, right? Teruma is consecrated, only priests can eat it. It's part of the tithing process, as only a few people are permitted to eat it, and therefore one can presume that it will remain uneaten during Shabbos, so you might as well get rid of it on Friday. However, non-sacred foods should be removed at their usual time on the 14th of Nissan itself. So you can see when we include the elucidation, we get a lot more information, and that's the way it's normally taught in a Daf Yomi class, right? You've got a teacher who has that much background, and he can fill in the Mishna as he's explaining it. That's why we rely on Rav Steinsaltz to help us out. The Gemara, it was taught in the Tosefta that Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok says, one time my father, Rabbi Tzadok, spent Shabbos in Yavne. So Yavne is where the sages set up, there was already a center of Torah learning in the small town of Yavne, north of Jerusalem. When the second temple fell, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai reestablished the Sanhedrin, the real center of the Jewish world, where the rabbinic court met to decide important cases. He moved the Sanhedrin to Yavne, and that's really what enabled Judaism to continue. It really might have fallen apart right there once the second temple fell. So this is, in a sense, whatever's going on in Yavne is the model for how Judaism is going to come to be practiced. But in those, what the whole Talmud is about, and particularly the Mishnah, is codifying what Judaism has already been and what it's going to be now that the temple is gone, right? We were already saying Shema twice a day. We were praying, but not in the same kind of codified, organized way as came about after the temple fell. But certainly the whole sacrificial system around which so much of the Torah system depended, now that was gone. So what was this project, the Judaism project, going to look like in the absence of the temple? And that's what the sages put together. And where did they do it? In Yavne. So Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok is saying, one time my father, Rabbi Tzadok, spent Shabbos in Yavne, and it was the 14th of Nissan, right? So that on Shabbos that morning, it was the day before Passover began that night, Motzi Shabbos, right after Shabbos ended, like right now. And it occurred that way. And Zonin, who was the appointee of Rabban Gamliel, right? So Zonin was like the head of the household for the head of the Sanhedrin, who at that time was Rabban Gamliel. And he came and said, the time has come to remove leavened bread. And I went with my father and we removed the leavened bread. So that's how we know that if the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbos, right? We don't burn the chametz on Friday. We would with teruma perhaps, but not with the regular chametz. Rather, we put it aside and then we get rid of it at the regular time, the beginning of the 6th hour. So about 11 a.m. On Shabbos morning. We can't burn it, so we would get rid of it a different way. That concludes our discussion of the 7th Mishnah. Now we move on to the 8th Mishnah. One who is traveling on Erev Pesach, the eve of Passover, meaning the 14th of Nisan, to slaughter his paschal lamb, to circumcise his son, or to eat at a betrothal feast in his father-in-law's house, and he remembers that he has leavened bread in his house, if he is able to return to his house and remove the leaven, and afterward return to the mitzvah, right? Because these things that he's involved in are all a mitzvah. He's going to slaughter the paschal lamb so that he can eat it that night by the Passover Seder. Or he's going to his betrothal feast at his father-in-law's house, right? He's engaged. He just became engaged. And when you have a party to celebrate the betrothal of a Jewish man and woman that they're going to get married, so that's a mitzvah party, right? It's not just a party. It's a party for the purpose of something beautiful that's a commandment in the Torah, so that has a special status. And likewise, to go do a circumcision, obviously that is a mitzvah. So if he's en route to do a mitzvah, and now he remembers that he has chametz, he has leaven in his house, so now he's got two competing values, right? Do I keep going to do the mitzvah that I'm going to do, or do I go back to my house to remove that chametz from my house? He just remembers there's some chametz left over there. He didn't get rid of it like the way he intended to. So if he's able to return to his house and remove the chametz and afterwards return to the mitzvah toward which he was traveling, so he should return home, remove the chametz, and then go do the mitzvah. But if there is not enough time for him to go home and remove the chametz and still complete the mitzvah that he already began, he should nullify it in his heart, as by Torah law, this is sufficient. Nullify it in his heart, meaning, I hereby declare that any chametz that is in my possession is hereby rendered ownerless, right? It's not mine. It may be found at my house, but I don't own it, right? Later, he'll destroy it as soon as the opportunity arises, but at least he will have gone through the formal process of declaring it ownerless, i.e. not his, right? So it won't be found in his possession. He won't own it. If one was traveling to save Jews from an attack by non-Jews, meaning, right, there's an attack, like terrorists are trying to kill Jews, from a flooding river, or from bandits, or from a fire, or from a collapsed building, he should not even attempt to return, and instead he should nullify the leaven in his heart. And this applies even if he could remove his leaven and still return to the previous activity, right? So when there's a danger to life, so even though you calculate that you could get home, remove the chametz from your house, and still go and save those lives, no, you don't take that calculation. You don't take that chance. You just charge forward to go save lives, do whatever you can, and just rely on nullifying the chametz in your heart that is at home. If, however, he went to do an optional mitzvah, like if he went to establish his Shabbos residence, right? What do we call that? Right? That's establishing an erev. Right? So for joining the boundaries. And so I want to move my Shabbos dwelling, as we talked about many times in Tractate Eruvin. Hold on a second. I lost my place. Where was I? Yeah. So anyway, so if you're changing your Shabbos dwelling for the purpose so that you can walk further on Shabbos, like that's not something you have to do. Even though you're doing that because you want to go hear a lecture by your favorite Torah teacher, it's still not something you have to do. That's an optional mitzvah. So therefore, in that case, you go home and remove the leaven, remove the chametz from your home, or any kind of optional mitzvah like that. And so too, the same halacha, the same law applies to one who left Jerusalem and remembered that there was consecrated meat in his hand. Right, so he was at the temple. He was offering sacrifices. As part of that, maybe it was a peace offering where some of the meat. I'm pretty sure in the peace offering, he's allowed to eat it with his friends, but he's supposed to eat it there at the temple, not walk away with it out of Jerusalem. Now it becomes disqualified when he leaves Jerusalem. Now, if you're gonna leave, whatever's left over, you're supposed to burn it there at the temple. He forgot. He put some of this meat in his pocket. Now he's walking away from Jerusalem down the hill. And he realizes, oh my gosh, I have this consecrated meat on me. What should I do? So one who left Jerusalem and remembered that there was consecrated meat in his hand, it's going to be these same rules, right? Meat that is taken out of Jerusalem becomes disqualified, and one is required to burn it in proximity to the temple. If he passed the area of Mount Scopus, beyond which one cannot see Jerusalem, he burns the meat at the site where he is located. And if he has not traveled that far, he should return and burn it before the temple with wood from the arrangement on the altar, because this wood was designated for burning consecrated items that became disqualified. The Mishnah asks, for how much leaven or consecrated meat is one required to return? Rabbi Meir says the volume of an egg. Rabbi Yehuda says the volume of an olive. And the rabbis say that the amount depends on the case. With regard to consecrated meat, he is required to return if he has the volume of an olive. But in the case where he remembers that he has leavened bread that was going to be offered on the temple, right? Not matzah for the purpose of eating during Passover, but unleavened bread that was going to accompany an offering on the altar, that's something you return for if you've got the volume of an egg. Right? If it's less than the volume of an egg, it's considered inconsequential, and you could just, get rid of it right there where you are. You don't have to walk all the way back up into the old city in Jerusalem and up to the Temple Mount, assuming the temple is standing, and destroy it there. That's our Mishnah. And so as we saw, part of this Mishnah was this idea that some mitzvahs are more important than others, at least in terms of this hierarchy of whether you continue to your mitzvah or whether you go home and remove chametz from your home. Now, we definitely have a general teaching that we don't know the value of mitzvahs. So we should be as careful with the seemingly inconsequential mitzvahs as we are with the seemingly important mitzvahs. We shouldn't be ranking mitzvahs. Nevertheless, here what we're talking about is certain mitzvahs have a time component, right? And getting chametz out of your house before Passover begins, that's a very pressing need. So you should drop whatever you're doing to go do that, unless what you're doing is a mitzvah and it's even more pressing, like saving a life. But not going to, an optional party. And so then the Gemara will discuss, well, wait a minute, we have a baraisa that says to go to a betrothal feast, right? So two Jews got engaged. Betrothal was a little bit different than getting engaged in modern times. It's like basically once they became betrothed, they haven't consummated the union, but they're technically married and they are prohibited to be with anyone else, right? It's the same consequences, if they were to go and, be with someone else, it would be the same as if they had already been fully married. And we'll be talking a lot about that in future volumes of the Talmud. But now there's a baraisa that contradicts the Mishnah, which says that that's an important mitzvah, and for that, if you have enough time to go home, remove the chametz, and then get to the betrothal feast, you can do that. Otherwise, just nullify the chametz in your heart and go to the feast. In the baraisa, it says we don't do that, right? In the baraisa, it says it's optional, and therefore we don't have to do that. So Rabbi Yehuda says it's a mitzvah, and Rabbi Yosef says it's a mitzvah, and apparently Rabbi Yehuda says it's optional, right? Rabbi Yehuda says it's optional, so you wouldn't have that choice. You should just run home and get the leaven, the chametz, out of your house. So once we start talking, this is what's going to cue the digression. Once we start talking about, whether this marriage feast is optional or not, that's going to get us to the digression. One idea is, well, there's actually a series of feasts. There's at least two feasts, right? Maybe there's a feast at the groom's house, and another, or at the father of the groom's house, and another at the father of the bride's house. And for the first feast, that's definitely a mitzvah, and you go to that. But for the second feast, that's optional, and it seems sort of deprioritized. Having discussed whether a betrothal feast is a mitzvah, is a commandment or not, the Gemara addresses a related issue. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says, a Torah scholar may not derive benefit from partaking in any feast that is not a mitzvah, right? So now the sages are going to start teaching lessons, and this is not like for the whole population. This is for Torah scholars, meaning older sages educating young sages, or at least anyone that considers himself a Torah scholar. Is a Torah scholar, for example, equivalent to a pious Jew? What we would call today an Orthodox Jew, or even an ultra-Orthodox, a Haredi Jew. Or is it just, somebody who he's going to make Torah learning a part of his life, but, maybe that's not his primary thing. He's a businessman and he makes sure he learns, maybe even does daf yomi, he learns every day. Does that make him a Torah scholar? Are the sages talking to that kind of person, man or woman? Or is it more like if you would grow up to be a sage, so you have to conduct yourself in a very elevated way, and one of those requirements is that you don't go partying. You don't go to, parties that are not for the sake of a mitzvah. Meaning, when we're talking about a feast where there's going to be eating and drinking, right? So if it's a feast that's not for the sake of the mitzvah, this to the sages, seems to reek of promiscuity and lightheaded behavior and conduct unbecoming of a Torah scholar, right? And indeed, a Torah scholar and an optional feast. Here's the halacha, the law. It is fitting for a Torah scholar to eat optional meals only in his home, and to avoid eating in the company of ignoramuses, ame haaretz. He should not eat excessively, even in the company of scholars. It is proper for him to participate in public feasts only when they constitute a mitzvah, such as the wedding of a Torah scholar and the daughter of a Torah scholar. Right? So they're not supposed to, go around partying, clubbing, etc., carrying on in that way, because that's going to be conduct unbecoming of somebody who is visibly and known as a Torah scholar, somebody who dedicates himself to studying and teaching Torah. That person should not be acting flippantly, cavalierly, partying, in an undignified way that could really lead to trouble. The Gemara asks, in what case does this statement apply, that he shouldn't go to a feast that's not a mitzvah? Rabbi Yochanan said, in a case where the daughter of a priest marries an Israelite, or where the daughter of a Torah scholar marries an am haaretz, an ignoramus. So here, it's not just that this is not a mitzvah, it's a wedding, that's a mitzvah, right? A wedding is a mitzvah. But there's going to be something deemed, sad and unfitting when this happens, right? When the daughter of a Torah scholar marries an am haaretz, an ignoramus, because presumably her children are not going to become Torah scholars. In fact, they're going to be separated from Torah. Now, to kind of get a little bit of background on this to understand, right? Why were the sages so against this? Now, for one explanation is that the Torah scholars, at this time within the Jewish world, at the time that the sages of the Talmud are operating, they are considered the most respected people in the Jewish world. And, there's very few secular Jews, right? So most people are operating within the framework. They're Jews and they follow Jewish law. So an ignoramus is somebody who purposely turns his back on Torah learning and therefore doesn't know what is required of him or her in terms of the mitzvahs. So if they turn their back on Judaism, right, this is 2,000 years ago, when they turn their back on Torah and on Jewish practice and they don't know how to do mitzvahs, so then by definition they're going to be transgressing right and left because they don't even know what it is that is required of them. So that kind of a person for sure is going to be problematic. You can't eat at their house. I mean, they're not going to be keeping a kosher kitchen. It's even going to be problematic doing business with them because they're ignorant of Torah law. And so they're not going to be meticulous with weights and measures. They're not going to be tithing properly. If you buy food from them, you're going to have to expect that it wasn't tithed. There's going to be a whole series of problems. They're not going to, in fact, they may be sexually promiscuous, who knows where they've been, who they've been with, etc. So the Torah scholars are saying to, the community of the Jewish people, the people who are Torah Jews, even if they're not scholars, you need to keep a distance from these ame haaretz. Now, what does am haaretz mean, by the way? That technically it means people of the land or nation of the land. And originally in Torah, it meant something else. It really just meant the non-Jews, right? Now, later in this Talmudic time, right, it's 1,000 years later than the Bible is written, by then it means something totally different. It's referring to Jews, not non-Jews. It's referring to Jews who have turned their back on Judaism. And they're considered, an unsavory element within the Jewish people. They're a minority, but they constitute a grave danger. And for good reasons, because at other times they weren't such a minority, right? And so in the whole Hanukkah story, which is not that long before what we're talking about here, there was just a big movement of Jews out of Judaism. And it was a real peril to the Jewish people, like Judaism could end because Jews are flowing away from Judaism. So the sages were very suspicious of these people and basically said, you shouldn't eat with them. You shouldn't, if you're doing business with them, you have to put up all kinds of, fences and barriers to make sure that the business can be conducted and doesn't lead to you making a Torah transgression because you're doing business with that person. So not surprisingly, the Amei Haaretz, the sort of people who had already turned their back on Judaism anyway, they had some kind of axe to grind with Torah and Torah Judaism, came to resent the Torah scholars who were decreeing against them. And so an enmity was really growing. And this idea, it was all, at times it was even like the Torah scholars weren't saying, it's not that they're bad people, it's not that we're against them, it's that we're trying to maintain a status of tahara, of ritual purity. They don't even know what tahara is, so they're probably always tameh, right? They're in a state of ritual impurity. They touch things they don't even realize that they shouldn't be touching. And so if we deal with them, we won't be in a state of purity, and then our friends, other Torah scholars, won't be able to eat in our house because they can't trust that we kept that food in a state of tahara, a state of ritual purity. So it's these kinds of things that led to a growing rift, right, between the Torah world and these Amei Haaretz. And so once the ignoramuses among the Jewish people felt that they were being not just rebuked, or not just that the Torah scholars were distancing themselves from them, but it's like they felt disapproved of, slandered, like that the Torah people had contempt for them, so they started having contempt back. Polarization, a deepening, growing, cavernous gap between the two sides. That just got uglier and uglier. And so now we start to understand, like, and then of course the ignoramuses became dangerous because the Torah scholars sort of were leading the Jewish people, but they were not the governing authority. The governing authority was Rome, which already had a problem with these Jews and their non-Roman ways. And so now the Amei Haaretz, the ignoramuses, who felt that the Torah scholars had contempt for them and they hated them back, would go to the Roman authorities and denounce the Torah Jews and get them arrested or even killed. And similar things were even going on in Babylonia, right? And so these non-Torah Jews, these ignorant of Torah law, and becoming proud of being ignorant and separated and having turned their back on the Jewish people, even would become dangerous and have Jews prosecuted and killed. So you can see it was like, the people was really splitting, and it was becoming, it would become dangerous. Over the many centuries since then, we sort of see, the sort of Torah Jews and the non-Torah Jews, almost like sometimes coming together, thrown by circumstance. To the anti-Semites of the world, there's no distinction between, the Torah Jews and the non-Torah people who happen to be Jews. They just, they hate all the Jews together. And so sometimes that outside pressure on the Jews would actually drive the Torah Jews and the ignoramuses, closer together. And at other times, their enmity would drive them apart. And we still see a lot of that today. Here at Accidental Talmudist, and at Chabad, and at Aish, we believe that the best way to unite the Jewish people is to give access to Torah learning to, every Jew that moves, right? So the more Torah knowledge is possessed by all Jewish people, the less of a rift there is between Torah Jews and Jews who haven't had the chance to learn Torah yet. And what's interesting, of course, here at Accidental Talmudist, we share with everybody. And very often, Jews who have no Torah learning come here and see non-Jews appreciate so much this wisdom that's been nurtured for 3,000 years, and see value in it. And then the Jews who haven't, had a Torah education ask themselves, well, if non-Jews value what we have so much, maybe I should check out this learning that's in my own backyard. And then that leads to more Torah learning and less of this rift. Anyway, that is some background on, how the attitude between Torah scholars and the Amei Haaretz, the ignoramuses, the people ignorant of Torah law, became, so polarized and so yawning, such a yawning gap between them. Okay, let's keep reading. So Rabbi Yochanan says, right, so this is a kind of mitzvah that the kind of feast that a Torah scholar shouldn't attend. When the daughter of a priest marries an Israelite, that's surprising. but when the daughter of a Torah scholar marries an ignoramus. And Rabbi Yochanan said, with respect to the daughter of a priest who marries an Israelite, their union will not be auspicious, as it is disgraceful for the priesthood when the daughter of a priest, of a Cohen, marries an Israelite. That has nothing to do with Torah learning. That's just that the daughter of one who is a Cohen, right, whose family is a Cohen, the lineage of Aaron, the brother of Moses, the priest, that she should try and marry a fellow Cohen. But the sages, even the sages of this period, don't all agree with that. The Gemara asks, well, what is meant by this statement, that their union will be inauspicious? Rav Chisda said, the inauspicious nature of such a marriage can be identified based on a verse describing the return of a daughter of a priest to her father's house after marrying a non-priest. If you look at Leviticus 22:13, it could be that she's going to return to her father's house, meaning that she becomes a widow, or she gets divorced, or she is barren, she's without children. Either, her husband will bury her or she will bury him. It's an inauspicious wedding when a Cohen's daughter marries an Israelite. But the Gemara says right away, wait a minute, is that really true? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say one who wishes to become wealthy should cling to the descendants of Aaron? The Kohanim, right, the priests, and all the more so should the merit of the Torah and the priesthood cause them to become wealthy. Now, originally, right, when the temple was standing and before, the sages really came into their own in the late Second Temple period, who was possessed the most Torah knowledge among the Jewish people were the Kohanim, because they needed to serve in the temple and bring the sacrifices in order to bring that, do their job correctly. They had to be educated thoroughly in Torah. And so we definitely have great sages who were priests, who were Kohanim. And so if you have that 1-2 punch of somebody who's, born into the priesthood and super educated in Torah, that's definitely somebody that you'd want to have join your family if possible. What do you mean inauspicious? We want to marry such people. And so says Rabbi Yochanan, we should marry them. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. In this case, where he becomes wealthy, it refers to a Torah scholar who marries a woman of priestly lineage. In that case, their union will be a successful one. But when the daughter of a Cohen marries an Am Haaretz, an ignoramus, then we could expect that something inauspicious will happen. The Gemara also relates that Rav Edi bar Avin married a daughter of a priest, and 2 sons who were ordained to decide halachic matters came from him. In other words, his sons were sages, namely Rav Sheshet, who we've heard many times, the son of Rav Edi, and Rabbi Yehoshua, the son of Rav Edi. And similarly, Rav Papa, who was a great sage, and every time we finish a volume of the Talmud, we invoke the merit of Rav Papa and his 10 sons, who all became Torah scholars. And Rav Papa said, had I not married the daughter of a Cohen, I would not have become wealthy. Wealthy and a great scholar, and all his sons are scholars. So it seems like, what's so bad about marrying the daughter of a Cohen? Sounds great. But on the other hand, Rav Kahana, who was not a priest, said, had I not married a daughter of a priest, I would not have been exiled, as Rav Kahana was forced to flee from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael. They said to him, but you were exiled to a place of Torah. You had to leave Babylonia, the Jewish community there. And where were you sent? To Israel to study in the Torah Academy of Rabbi Yochanan. So it doesn't seem like it was so bad for you. And he answered, I was not exiled as people are generally exiled, meaning I did not ascend to Israel of my own free will. I was forced to go. So we might as well mention the story of Rav Kahana because it's so colorful. So Rav Kahana, first of all, there's several Rav Kahanas. There's, I think, 4 Rav Kahanas. One very well known for being a student of Rav, who was so fierce to learn Torah that at one point he even hid under Rav's bed to kind of listen to how Rav was with his wife in the privacy of their bedroom. And they were like, they were making like a pillow talk. And Rav Kahana made a noise or said something. I can't remember exactly what the story was. And Rav said, "Who's there?" And he said, "It's me, Rav Kahana." He says, "What the hell are you doing here? Get out!" And he says, "Well, this too is Torah, and I must learn," right? Because he wanted to learn what is the Torah way for a Torah scholar to be with his wife. Obviously, he should have asked, not tried to learn by watching. Generally, it is considered a superior way to learn to see the example of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, how he conducts his life, and to emulate him. But in terms of the privacy of the bedroom, you shouldn't be there. That's a very famous story of Rav Kahana. That is not our Rav Kahana that we're talking about right now. Our Rav Kahana was also a student of Rav and very jealous of the honor of his teacher, Rav. And it happened, so there was this story. Let me just get this in front of me because it's worth it reading. Okay, so Rav Kahana was sitting in the presence of Rav when a man came and threatened to endanger another Jew's life by drawing the attention of the king's officials to that person's assets. In other words, there was like a Jewish informer, no doubt in Am Haaretz, and what he was, and there was probably like a Torah scholar who was also wealthy, and this other, and so the informer Jew went to the Babylonian authority and said, this guy's really rich. If you can find a way to kill him, you could take all his money and give me a cut, right? So it's a really horrible thing to do. Rav Kahana jumped up and broke the man's neck, eliminating the threat. Rav, who approved of the deed, for it is permissible to kill someone who is threatening the life of another person, nevertheless feared reprisals from the local authorities and sent Rav Kahana to Eretz Yisrael to escape them. However, because Rav considered it improper for Rav Kahana to have acted thus without consulting him, right? So Rav Kahana saved a life, but there may have been a better way to save the life of the one who the informer was going to turn in than to just kill the informer. It was too impulsive. It was a lynching, right? Maybe it was a very well-founded one. Maybe it was permissible under Torah law, but still he should have consulted with the Torah authority in his area, who was Rav. He should have come to Rav and said, how should we handle this? Not just jumped on the man's neck. Maybe there was no time. Nevertheless, Rav thought that Rav Kahana was a little too dangerous, a little too hot-headed. So he instructed him that. So what happened? So Rav sent Rav Kahana to Israel, right, to Eretz Yisrael at this point under Roman authority, and he says, go up there, and he instructed him that when he should arrive in Eretz Yisrael, and he should join Rabbi Yochanan's yeshiva, right, in Yavne, and he must remain silent. I think it was in Yavne. By then it might have been in Tiberias, actually. It might have been in Tiberias. But he should join Rabbi Yochanan's yeshiva, and he must remain silent in Rabbi Yochanan's presence for 7 years, and not question or object to any of his rulings, and this would atone for his impulsiveness, for his impetuousness, right? So Rav said to Rav Kahana, you're too impulsive. Now you have to leave here so we don't all get in trouble for keeping you from the authorities, from harboring you. Go up to Israel, study in Rabbi Yochanan's yeshiva, and as an atonement, as a teshuvah, for the way you behaved here, you should just sit in Rabbi Yochanan's class and not talk and not question his rulings for 7 years. Rav Kahana arrived during Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, right, the colleague, the good friend and debate partner of Rabbi Yochanan. So he arrived during Reish Lakish's repetition of Rabbi Yochanan's lecture, and later approached him with a slew of questions and objections. Reish Lakish then rushed to Rabbi Yochanan and said, a lion has ascended from Babylonia. Prepare carefully for the next day's lecture. The next day, during Rabbi Yochanan's lecture, Rav Kahana was seated in the first row. However, he remained silent in Rabbi Yochanan's presence as Rav had instructed. As a result, he was demoted to the 7th row. And Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, this lion of whom you spoke has turned into a fox. In other words, he's quiet because presumably he's ignorant. Rav Kahana was mortified by his disgrace, and he prayed to God, and he said, "May it be your will that these 7 rows with which I have been dishonored should take place of the 7 years which Rav spoke to me." He then requested that Rabbi Yochanan repeat the lecture, and he proceeded to question and object to everything he said. And besides being reinstated to his position in the front row, as the lecture proceeded and Rav Kahana continued to challenge Rabbi Yochanan, in recognition of Rav Kahana's greatness, had the mats upon which he sat removed beneath him until he was sitting on the floor like a student, meaning the great Rabbi Yochanan lowered himself so he would be on the same level as Rav Kahana. This is how much Torah scholars value Torah learning, right? Even the great Rabbi Yochanan, who's like the greatest authority in the Jewish world at that time, when he recognizes how great a scholar has come to learn from him from Babylonia, the guy keeps interrupting, but his questions are all so on point and they show so much learning. Rather than be offended by all the interruptions, honors this man and his learning. So Rav Kahana, ends up having, he's honored and he does well the whole time he's learning in Israel. But over time, maybe all that interrupting and that same impetuousness that led him to be exiled from Babylonia, eventually he didn't have such a great relationship with everybody in Israel either. And he ended up at the end of his life going back to Babylonia and reestablishing himself there. At any rate, Rav Kahana says, maybe I shouldn't have married a priest's daughter because I thought that would be good for me, but I ended up having a tough life because of it. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak says, anyone who benefits from partaking in an optional feast, now he's talking about Torah scholars, which is not a mitzvah, will ultimately be exiled, as it is stated in Amos 6:4, and eat the lambs of the flock and the calves out of the midst of the stall. And then it is written, therefore now they shall go into exile at the head of the exiles, and the revelry of those who stretch themselves out shall pass away. Maybe not just for Torah scholars, right? If we're going to just be partying and lightheaded and, not be learning Torah in favor of just, drinking and partying and having a good time and missing opportunities to learn, maybe life won't go so well, and that's what we're learning here. The Gemara continues discussing a Torah scholar who benefits from optional feasts. The sages taught any Torah scholar who feasts excessively everywhere degrades himself and brings suffering upon himself. Ultimately, he will destroy his house, widow his wife, orphan his children, and his studies will be forgotten. Much dispute will come upon him, and his words will not be heeded, and he will desecrate God's name and the name of his master and the name of his father, and he will cause a bad name for himself, his children, and his descendants throughout future generations. All of that from just going to parties that are not mitzvahs, optional parties, right? But that is definitely directed at Torah scholars, right? So this is a group of people, they're like special forces. They're the elite of the Torah squad. So they have to conduct themselves in an elite way. It's not that people should never have parties. But if you're going to conduct yourself, if you aspire to be a Torah scholar, then you have to separate yourself from that kind of lightheaded, flippant living. On the topic of proper marriage partners, and now we really get into ignoramuses, the sages taught one should always be willing to sell all he has to marry the daughter of a Torah scholar. Why? Because if he dies or he's exiled and he cannot raise his children, he can be assured that his sons will be Torah scholars, since their mother will ensure that the boys are well educated. And one should not marry the daughter of an ignoramus, because if he dies or he's exiled, his sons will be ignoramuses. Furthermore, the sages taught one should always be willing to sell everything he has in order to marry the daughter of a Torah scholar and in order to marry off his daughter to a Torah scholar. And this type of marriage can be compared to grapevines that intertwine with grapevines, and that's a thing of beauty. But when the son of a Torah scholar marries the daughter of an ignoramus, or a Torah scholar marries the daughter of an ignoramus, then to what can that be compared? To a grapevine that intertwines with a bramble, a berry bramble. And that's considered no-go, right? A no-good. As we've seen kilayim, this mixture of diverse kinds, right? We wouldn't grow something, a berry plant, alongside a grapevine. And that's what they're saying. Torah scholars should keep in the world of Torah scholars and not go marry ignoramuses or the children of ignoramuses. Furthermore, the sages taught a person should always be willing to sell off all he has to marry the daughter of a Torah scholar, and if he cannot find the daughter of a Torah scholar, well, then he should marry one of the great people of the generation, meaning somebody who's pious, even though they're not a Torah scholar. If he cannot find the daughter of a pious person, he should marry the daughter of one of the heads of the congregations. If he cannot find the daughter of one of the heads of the congregations, he should marry the daughter of the charity collectors. If he cannot find the daughter of one of the charity collectors, he should marry the daughter of the school teachers. However, he should not marry the daughter of an am haaretz. He should not marry the daughter of an ignoramus because they are, and I'm just gonna read what it says here, because they are vermin and their wives are similar to a creeping animal, as their lifestyle involves the violation of numerous prohibitions, and with regard to their daughters, the verse states, "Cursed is he who lies with an animal." They've really pushed the point. Now, it is also true that when the sages are trying to educate young future sages, they will engage in hyperbole and really exaggerate the point and go, not so far as what they really believe, but using very strong language. These days we become much more attuned to the powers and dangers of language, and this is very painful to our ear. But in the old days, they used language a little bit differently, and what they were saying is, listen to me. If you want your children to grow up Torah Jews, make sure you marry Torah Jews, right? That's the bottom line in the strong language. Now, Rabbi Akiva was an am haaretz who eventually found Torah, right? So and how did that happen? How did the great Rabbi Akiva, who's really compared to Moses in the history of the Jewish people as like either at the level of Moses or just a hair beneath Moses in the greatness of his Torah study, and yet he was fully ignorant before he came to Torah. Like Moses, by the way. Moses learned something from his own mother when she became his nursemaid, as we read in last week's Torah portion. But he grew up in the house of Pharaoh and then eventually, moved out to Midian and in the house of of a priest, right, of Jethro, his father-in-law. Certainly not a Jew, but eventually came across the burning bush and came to God and, and became the great lawgiver and the greatest prophet in the history of the Jewish people. But likewise, Akiva was a total am haaretz, a total am haaretz. What saved him? His wife, Rachel. Akiva's wife saw potential in him and said she would marry him if he would learn Torah. Says Rabbi Akiva, when I was an am haaretz, when I was an ignoramus, I said, who will give me a Torah scholar so that I will bite him like a donkey? His students said to him, Master, say that you would bite him like a dog. Why do you have to say a donkey? He said to them, no, I specifically used the word donkey because the donkey bites and breaks bones, and a dog just bites and doesn't break bones. He's telling you that when he was an am haaretz, it's not just that he didn't care about Torah and he didn't care about Torah scholars, it's that he actively hated them. And if he had a chance to harm them, he would, right? And so that's a warning to these young Torah scholars. So don't you go marry someone like I was. That's what Rabbi Akiva was saying there. How are we doing on time? This is running pretty long, but I am almost done with what I'm sharing for the Gemara. So if you've got questions or comments, put them in. Okay, and it was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Meir would say, anyone who marries off his daughter to an ignoramus, to an am haaretz, it's as though he binds her and places her before a lion. So again, what is their opinion of these ignoramuses? Just as a lion first mauls its prey, right? Mauls it with its claws and with its teeth and really harms it, right? Terrible gashes in the prey, and then eats it and has no shame. So too, an ignoramus beats his wife and then engages in sexual relations with her without appeasing her first and has no shame, right? So that's the opinion of the Torah scholars toward these ignoramuses. But on a more sensitive note, right, maybe a little bit later, somebody who's thinking, maybe the way we should handle Amei Haaretz, these ignoramuses, is to teach them Torah so that they won't be ignorant anymore. But at least we should be a little sensitive to the fact that they are this way and they have this enmity toward us because they didn't know, they didn't learn. Right? So Rabbi Akiva taught, anyone who engages in Torah study in the presence of an ignoramus, causing the ignoramus to be embarrassed and anguished over his inability to study Torah, it is considered as though he had sexual relations with the ignoramus's betrothed bride in his presence, as it is stated, Moses commanded us the Torah, an inheritance, morasha, for the congregation of Jacob. Do not read it as inheritance, morasha, rather as betrothed, meorasa. And the Torah is compared to a betrothed bride of the Jewish people until one studies it and thereby consummates his marriage to it, right? So what Rabbi Akiva is saying is, the real reason we have this terrible enmity between the Torah scholars and those who turn their back on Torah, the ignoramuses, right, is because they're anguished. Maybe they don't even realize that they hate us, but they haven't had a chance to learn. So what you should not do is learn in front of them. Meaning, don't be learning and not teach, right? Don't use your Torah as a cudgel, as a weapon. Don't use it as a crown over your head and not share it with them. That embarrasses them. And as we've seen many times, to humiliate another person publicly, it should be preferable to you to jump in a fiery furnace and kill yourself rather than to humiliate another person publicly. So at least according to Rabbi Akiva, we should be teaching them or at least avoiding them, but certainly not learning Torah in their presence and not teaching them. And finally, Rabbi Akiva also said the hatred which ignoramuses have for a Torah scholar is greater than the hatred that the nations of the world, meaning the non-Jews, have for the Jewish people, right? These secular non-Torah Jews hate the Torah Jews, hate the Torah scholars, even more than the Jew haters, the anti-Semites, hate the Jews. And it was taught in the Tosefta, and he finishes and he says, and the wives of the ignoramuses hate Torah scholars even more than the ignoramuses themselves. Why? Because the ignoramuses and the Torah scholars at least do business together sometimes. And the ignoramuses can come to learn that the Torah scholars conduct themselves like righteous people, like mensches. And so even though they don't have the Torah, they come to respect them. And we see many times, examples of somebody who, he wasn't a Torah Jew, but he came to have a deep friendship with a Torah scholar. And then eventually was influenced by that. But the wife of this guy isn't dealing with the Torah scholar. All she hears is that the Torah scholars look down on the ignoramuses. And so, of course, she develops ill will toward the Torah scholars. And what's the best way to cure that rift? Share the Torah knowledge wherever possible. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. Let me see if there's some comments or questions on that. Hold on a second. Document has to reload. Okay. So there's a conversation about whether Orthodox Jews consider, Jews who belong to synagogue congregations like conservative or reformed to be Amei Haaretz. So Sharon says, I'm not sure how what you are saying implies about folks like me who studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary or conservative educational institution. Where do we fall out in this paradigm of Amei Haaretz versus Torah scholars? We're talking about 2,000 years ago, right? So first of all, if you were asked Torah scholars today, do we bear this kind of ill will toward ignoramuses? The answer is no. The answer is no, not at all. What now? Because one of the primary reasons that began that rift, right, was that, for instance, in terms of eating, the haverim, right, the sort of the friends of the society of the scholars who were meticulous to only eat things that were in a state of tahara. So now we're all tameh, right? We're all in a state of ritual impurity. So that kind of concern is gone. And if you look at the great leading, the Gedolim of our generation, they all believe. They don't all do it, right? They don't all do it, but they all believe it's one of the highest values there is to be involved in kiruv, right? So anybody that's involved in Jewish education, that's a good thing. Where there's going to be trouble, between the Orthodox world and the conservative world is that the Orthodox will believe that certain teachings within the conservative world are against what they consider to be Torah. We're not going to get into what those issues are right now, but certainly they would agree that, the vast amount of Torah learning is Torah, and that the more that is shared, the better. Where they're going to object is where people are teaching things that they say are true, and sort of traditional Judaism would say is not true. That's going to be problematic. But in terms of this harsh attitude toward people that have no learning at all, I don't think that exists today. I think it's much more compassion and let's get these people learning if at all possible. In terms of, somebody who comes from an Orthodox family and their child is going to go marry somebody that doesn't have any Torah learning at all, they're not going to like that, because they're going to be afraid that their grandchildren are not going to be Torah Jews, right? And maybe I won't even marry Jews at all. There's certainly lots of stats about that. People who are not learning end up marrying non-Jews, and that is not good for the Jewish people. Okay. And Brinna says JTS, I guess this is part of the discussion you guys have been having in the comments, and Brinna says that JTS, the Jewish Theological Ceremony, is highly respected in my Orthodox circle, right? So Brinna's in an Orthodox world. She says JTS very respected there, and for good reason. And even more so these days when the line between modern Orthodox and conservative is thinner. It's an institution of impressive scholarship, in my humble opinion. So the Orthodox world will look down on certain teachings of the conservative world because it's just not what they do. But it's really certain teachings, right? And probably 99% of what they're doing, and any community, like, for example, Temple Beth Am here in LA, where, it's a big conservative congregation and also includes like hundreds of families who are in shul, in synagogue every Shabbos, and who are usually walking to there, those are Shabbos observant Jews. Why are they in a conservative congregation, not an Orthodox congregation? They have their reasons. But what we all want, at least among the Jewish people, is more Jews doing more mitzvahs, right? That's the main thing, is to get more Jews doing more mitzvahs, fulfilling more commandments. Because I believe, and our sages would say, that when Jews are not, being Jewish, when Jews are not doing mitzvahs, it's not just bad for them, it's not just bad for the Jewish people, it's bad for the whole world. Jews have a mission in this world. Everybody here has a mission in this world. Part of the mission of Jews is to do mitzvahs. And when Jews, en masse are not doing mitzvahs, there's a price for that in the world. It's bad for the world. So the more Jews doing the more mitzvahs, the better. Renee, our shul is dual affiliated, conservative reconstructionist. I learn from Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi and the renewal movement. Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi came from Chabad and ended up creating his own movement. And again, he came from the philosophy of Chabad. Let's get more Jews, doing more mitzvahs, doing more Torah learning. He had a different way to teach and to approach, but he pulled a lot of people under the wings of the Shekhinah, as it were, taking Jews who were not doing anything Jewish and getting them to practice Judaism. And she says, I'm sure I'm considered an ignoramus. I would say, no way, Renee, because I've seen your questions so many times, and I would not consider you an ignoramus remotely, right? Ignoramus really means, I was an ignoramus. I just didn't know anything. I was lucky. I went to Hebrew school when I was a kid. I had a bar mitzvah. But I was bored. I was uninspired. It was really my own problem. I don't blame my teachers. I don't blame the rabbis. I don't blame anybody but me. But I was just away from Judaism for a long time. And then when I saw how inspiring it could be, I was just so happy to return. And, over time, we've created this community of people who are inspired, to get more Jews closer to Judaism and the world closer to Hashem. Yes, Nina's reminding me that when I interviewed Rav Steinsaltz, the one who wrote the elucidation and commentary in the Koran Talmud, I interviewed him for an accidental Talmudist video, and I told him my story. A lot of you have heard me tell it before. I won't tell the whole story now. But basically how, I had been completely ignorant, but then I started learning and taking classes. And then every rabbi that I would hear teach would mention the Talmud, and I wanted to learn what the Talmud was. I just didn't know what it was, and I would be in a Jewish bookstore and see those volumes of Talmud, so many of them. To me, it looked like 3 Encyclopedia Britannicas, the Art Scroll Talmud, right? Like this, but 72 volumes of it. And I was always intimidated. And then I finally decided to just buy the first book and see what it's like. And I took it to the kid at the counter, who was Zach Plotzker. I didn't know his name at that time. And he said, "Oh, you're doing Daf Yomi." And I said, "What's Daf Yomi?" And he looked at me like this. And as I'm telling this story to Rav Steinsaltz, I then said, and I felt like such an idiot. I said, I felt like such an idiot. And Rav Steinsaltz said, worse than an idiot. Among Jews, an ignoramus is worse than an idiot. Right? And Zach, was very nice, didn't treat me like an idiot or an ignoramus. He said, well, Daf Yomi is a worldwide program where people learn the entire Talmud by reading 1 page a day. It takes 7.5 years. And today is day 1 of that cycle, right? So I happened to buy book 1 of the Talmud on day 1 of a 7.5 year cycle. That's how I became the accidental Talmudist. That was, I think, March 2nd, 2005. So when that cycle began in 2005, and it was very, very difficult to be so ignorant and doing Daf Yomi, but I felt like God put the book in my hand, and so I stayed with it for 7.5 years, and then I started blogging about it, and here we are. But when I told that story to Rav Steinsaltz, his comment was, when I called myself an idiot, he said, no, worse than an idiot. An idiot is just somebody, who's not very bright. That's not his fault. But an ignoramus is somebody who has the opportunity to learn and chooses not to. And the truth is that all Jews in the world know at some level that there's a Torah, that they ought to be learning from it, and that there's things that they're required to do. And if they just fully turn their back on that and never learn it, okay, then they're being ignorant. But really, in a sense, it's not their fault, because they probably have only been exposed to some boring version of Judaism. They never had an inspiring teacher. They never had inspiring teachings. And with God's help and yours, we can get the word out to them, right? And that's why accidental Talmudist is not a person. It's a community, right? And so if you've stumbled into this class, it's so important that if you learn something that's enjoyable to you, you share it with somebody that might benefit from it and might get inspired to learn more. At the simplest level, you can share some of our postings on Facebook with other people. Or you can, personally call someone, or when you're with somebody, just, teach some Torah that is meaningful to you. Because then you're an accidental Talmudist, and you're doing the job of transmitting this authentic, proven, preserved for 3,000 years wisdom that just needs to be in the world to save people from ignorance. Lynn says, I have wondered about the origin of the disparaging implication of the term Amei Haaretz, for land itself and farmers are honorable. Seems some other term would work better in describing this kind of ignorance. But there it is. And wasn't Reish Lakish also an Am Haaretz? Yes, he was. Worse. Right? Reish Lakish wasn't just an ignoramus. He was a bandit. He was a full-fledged criminal. When Rabbi Yochanan saved him and saw the potential in him to learn, and he ended up becoming, basically the second greatest scholar of his generation. But more important than that, Rabbi Yochanan's partner in learning, and Rabbi Yochanan felt that nobody else could push him to learn new things and to, sort of dream up new rulings and new perspectives on Torah. Like, he couldn't learn without a partner like Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish was an Am Haaretz who came in. So it's not, it's really not about looking down on people. Even back then, it's just the state of those people, right? The fact that they were ignorant, that was the problem. Once they would come under the wings of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence, meaning once you start learning Torah, you're considered to be under the wings of the divine presence of the Lord. It's that powerful. Okay, we have really run long. I hope today was inspiring. I hope people, are taking these learning and this lesson and these teachings in the right spirit. Our situation is different today than it was 2,000 years ago, and the attitude of today's Torah scholars is not the same toward the Amei Haaretz as what it was among the sages, but the attitude toward ignorance must be, let's cure it. Have a good night.